I'm quite animated by the post-World War I era, which I think has some really chilling parallels to the circumstances that we're dealing with today.
We see the possibility of profound change in the US-China relationship that could have reverberations not only throughout Asia, but throughout the world, particularly because we're in this moment where our allies and partners around the world are not sure who we stand with.
I think even those elements of our closest partnerships with Europe and Asia are frankly at risk now. I'm not sure all these countries will stay with us.
Hi, I'm Mira Rapp-Hooper, a partner here at the Asia Group, and you're listening to What Comes Next. I come from a background as a political scientist who made her way into government, most recently as the senior director for East Asia and Oceania at the National Security Council. And now I'm here at TAG, where I advise clients on how they can make their best business decisions in this critical region. For a very long time, I have had the sense that the world around us is changing in some profound ways. Whether that's the nature of US leadership, the fact that China is now a fully risen major power, or the rate of rapid technological diffusion that has been reshaping our world, it has seemed to me like one era is ending, even as we do not entirely know what will follow it. We're launching this podcast because we believe that only if you closely examine these geopolitical forces that are reshaping our world can you really know how best to operate in this environment and to make the best business decisions in front of you. As we kick off, there is no conversation that I'm more excited to have than to speak with Dr. Kurt Campbell. He is, of course, the co-founder and chairman here at the Asia Group and was formerly the Deputy Secretary of State. He's the architect of the United States pivot to Asia and was the coordinator for Indo-Pacific policy at the White House. He's also a mentor and dear friend of mine. I'm thrilled to welcome to the first episode of What Comes Next, Kurt Campbell. There's really no one else I'd rather talk to about the big issues that are reshaping our world today. Kurt, thank you so much for being here.
Right back at you, Mira. I'm thrilled to do this. We were just talking before this. We're both kind of geeking out about this, the opportunity to explore what these enormous changes that we're seeing on the international stage, what it means for the future, what it means for business, what it means for our livelihoods and peace and stability. Let's get into it.
Let's jump right in. So, Kurt, I'd love to step back and ask you to reflect for our listeners on what this moment is that we're currently living through. I think there are a number of different ways to characterize it, but in many of those different characterizations, something is ending or something has ended. And the whole reason we're doing this podcast is because we don't know what exactly comes next. How do you think about what this moment is?
Thanks for that. Look, the truth is one of the most difficult things when analyzing global politics is to understand when one era is ending and at least the glimmers of a new one is emerging. I'm not sure that this is that hard this time. It's so obvious that we are embarking on really a departure from the norms and values that have animated American engagement, not just globally, but at home, really for most of our founding, but most specifically in the post-World War II era, what we often refer to as Pax Americana. So many of the dominant elements that have led to purposeful American engagement on the international scene have been laid to waste, have been challenged in ways that are completely surprising in some respects. And frankly, we're at the very early stages of that, Maren. So the hardest thing for us is, as we look forward, what are the tools that we can call upon that give us some ways to help interpret what is likely to come next for you and I think one of the positives about being trained in international relations is that we have a canon of history to call upon. I'm quite animated by the post-World War I era, which I think has some really chilling parallels to the circumstances that we're dealing with today.
I very much agree with that. I want to pull on a thread of something that you offered up there, Kurt, which is the idea that what is happening, what is unraveling right now is the United States itself sort of laying to waste the precepts of a prior system and the way it operated in that system. And what I want to ask is whether you see this moment of profound change as largely being exacerbated by the United States and its drastic change in behavior, or whether there are also structural underlying elements that might have taken place regardless of who was president of the United States. In my own thinking, in my own writing, I think about this as a series of long-term trends that have sort of been accumulating for at least a decade or more, really since the global financial crisis, shifts in relative power, the rapid diffusion of technology, so on and so forth. But that all of those have been accelerated drastically and rapidly by changes in American political leadership and in global behavior. But I'm curious how you parse the question of structure versus agency.
Yeah. Look, as I look at this and compare it to previous periods, in almost every case when a system has collapsed or has been transitioned, it has largely come from external forces, another powerful country that seeks to usurp or challenge or change the global system. But the real truth is that it is the United States itself that is challenging the system that we ourselves helped establish decades ago. And what's fascinating, what President Trump and his team is doing is basically making an argument that previous leaders made a pact that has been particularly unrewarding to certain segments of the American people. And so I don't think the worldview is particularly coherent, but it has been very powerful in terms of arguing that the system that has been operating for the last several decades has not served the interests of a certain group of American people, folks that didn't graduate beyond high school, who have worked in general jobs that are increasingly scarce. All of those things have contributed to a degree of dissatisfaction with the current system. But at the same time, I think, as we'll get into, there are many elements of Pax Americana that we take for granted. And once they are lost, we will regret it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I want to sort of parse what might be being lost, even as we sit here and start the conversation about it. So you've already alluded to the upending of the global trading order as we knew it, right? Which obviously was highly imperfect. I think any of us would admit profound flaws, and that's been obvious on both sides of the political aisle for, again, at least 10 years at this point. From the point that we failed to ratify TPP, it has been clear that trade was a live wire issue that was not going to be the same again in American politics. But beyond that, broad skepticism towards and questioning of alliances and the question of whether kind of advanced American security entanglements for the sake of deterrence and preservation of peace are worth it. Seemingly questions about the restraint on the use of force. Certainly basic questions about international law and institutions as legitimate governing bodies. All of these accumulate to, as you say, not just a testing of norms, but an explicit position that a system that was set up to prevent World War I, World War II from happening again actually no longer serves American interests. And as Secretary Rubio said in his own confirmation hearing, that system has been weaponized against us. So what you're pointing to is actually, I think, a very willful and directed desire to test the precepts of that system and reject many of them outright. But the question is, what comes next? If that's true, what will it look like, both for the United States and for its partners to operate in a world where international law matters less, where the UN is not as significant, where it's not clear whether or not the WTO really represents the global trading order. How do you start to think about what the contours of this next period look like, this more sort of chaotic interregnum that we seem to be moving into as we sort through the rubble of what seems to be coming down around us?
I think what you are seeing is the beginnings of an enunciation of a worldview. What we saw during the early part of the Trump administration was a critique of the previous system, but less about what the elements from their perspective would be of the new system. But we're starting to see through a variety of case studies what, in fact, animates some of the people around President Trump. And there is a view that almost 19th century imperialism is the order of the day. And that is playing out in front of us in Venezuela, in threats against Greenland, concerns about what happens next in other places in Latin America, Cuba, and Colombia. It is, in many respects, this return to elements of the Monroe Doctrine, but much more bombastic and threatening, even than that period, which was noted by sheer power politics playing out in Latin and South America. And so that's the issue that worries me the most, this spheres of influence. We can have our way here. Mira, one of the things that I believed was a foundational element of the world that we were living in was the idea, which I thought was quite bipartisan, that we would be better off working with allies and partners. I think even those elements of our closest partnerships with Europe and Asia are frankly at risk now. I'm not sure all these countries will stay with us if we are embarking upon an effort to militarily seize Greenland.
I completely agree. And I think one of the things that's most disorienting about this moment is it increasingly is impossible to divine who the United States stands with, who it stands against, and what it stands for. And that makes it really, really difficult to know how we're going to chart our pathway in global affairs when so many of those basic touchstones seem to be up for grabs. And I actually want to use that to transition to a series of topics that are very close to your and my heart, which is, of course, Asia and U.S.-China relations and how this moment of incredible change is playing out in that U.S.-China relationship. You and I have both been part of the Asia watching, Asia policy making community for the last many years. You, the architect of the U.S. pivot to Asia under the Obama administration, but also a supporter of Republican efforts to carry forward some of those policies under the first Trump administration, committed to working on a bipartisan basis with Congress to make sure that all of our efforts in Asia were carried forward with maximum consensus. What we appear to have started to see in the last few months, and in particular as trade negotiations between the United States and China have accelerated, is the beginning, perhaps, of a dissolution of what we had come to think of as a China consensus in the United States. The idea that the United States and China were locked in an inexorable competition across different areas of policy, security, defense, technology, economics, trade, so on and so forth. And instead, a strong drive by President Trump and his team to pursue some form of a rapprochement with China, clearly in the interest of securing a trade deal, but with a willingness to make significant concessions in other policy areas that would not have been previously conceivable. Those include, of course, a decision to export new NVIDIA chips to PRC markets, but also include many reports of the Trump administration flirting with the possibility of revising American policy towards Taiwan as a concession to the PRC to get that trade deal and to get that historic visit. As we look into 2026, a year in which President Xi and President Trump stand to meet as many as 4 or 5 times before the year is out, we see the possibility of profound change in the US-China relationship that could have reverberations not only throughout Asia, but throughout the world, particularly because we're in this moment where our allies and partners around the world are not sure who we stand with.
Yeah.
Where are we on US-China?
Yeah.
And where do you see this headed over the course of this year?
So, Mary, I thought you laid it out extraordinarily well there. I do. We both study the signposts in U.S.-China relations. My own sense is that there is a deep ambiguity at the very core and heart of U.S. Strategic thinking about China in the Trump administration. It is the biggest, broadest tent imaginable when it comes to China. You have some senior officials who believe we can cut really good deals with China, commercial deals, and get along just fine. And you have others that believe that China is a transcendent, existential threat to our way of life and to American standing on the global stage. If you're looking for, kind of ultimate sort of directional indicators, on the one hand, you've seen, as you pointed out, a decision to allow our most prized technological innovations flow now more directly to China. You've seen the president resurrect language around the G2 that I think many find deeply concerning, and our allies and partners in particular. You've seen, the president make clear how much he looks forward to engaging. He's clearly attracted to President Xi and his authoritarian, autocratic ways. But at the same time, you also have the United States basically saying that China and Russia have to leave Venezuela. You have the president trying to take steps to ease the very real areas of vulnerability we have in terms of critical minerals and rare earths. And you've seen the largest arms sales in modern times to Taiwan. Those would suggest maybe factors that cut in the other direction. My own sense, however, is I am concerned that the ultimate trend is towards either a rapprochement or an acquiescence to China that I do not believe is in our strategic interests. One of the things that I thought we were witnessing, as you point out, is a profound level of bipartisan commitment to a competitive framework. And we were trying to refine that in ways that could be sustained, that could be sold to the American people, and that the strategic and tactical elements that would support that would continue. I'm not sure I see that consensus today. I think what we are seeing is that there are elements, frankly, in both parties that appear to be flirting with defecting from that consensus. You've got corporate Republicans on the investing side that are looking to give the 1990s go-go period of hopeful engagement with China another chance, and you've got liberal engagers who sort of bemoan this global partnership concept that was more animating 20 years ago. They are also interested in figuring out what's possible. I don't believe those trends are strong, and I do believe that there is a strong underlying anxiety about China. I think in the end, you've made this point in your good writing, Mira, the structural issues are such that I think it will be difficult for the United States to simply, bring the Chamberlain umbrella to Xi's doorstep. I think there will be too many in the United States that will question that overall approach. If there are going to be any international issues in which a kind of faint Republican opposition will emerge. I think, Mira, it will likely be on China policy. And so we're going to have to watch carefully. The deal that looks to be emerging for April is a profoundly bad one, continuing ease of restrictions on U.S. technology to China, the subtle signals that you lay out that would suggest that the United States and China are working more together and have anxieties about Taiwan. That would be very dangerous to, Taiwan's delicate psychology and political status. If they felt like the United States was no longer backing them, it would have terrible consequences for them politically, I fear. And I think in exchange, what the president really wants is very short-term gains, agricultural purchases that then he can make the argument to particular groups around the United States that he's fulfilling his promise, and then maybe a little bit more on fentanyl. That is a manifestly bad deal. Technology in Taiwan for legumes and fentanyl, that does not fall in the category of world-class deal making in my perspective. I think the other thing I just point out, Mira, and this is something that we've both commented on, during the first term, there was no country more disorganized and challenged by the election of President Trump. And, we know that President Xi felt that his remarkable foreign policy apparatus failed him because they all thought that there was very little chance that President Trump would be elected. And so they spent much of the first term off balance. That is not the case the second term. They are much more prepared, and you see a clear strategy on the part of China, inexorable, and they believe that this is their time. I think the issue is going to be my own experience. We wrote a piece many years ago about how China operates on the international scene. One of the things that we pointed out then that I think has continued, despite the capabilities and the dexterity that China has demonstrated on the international scene, it is also the case that very few countries are more inclined to overstep than China. And I think there is a very real chance that they will take a step in the South China Sea or against a partner, Japan, that will be a bridge too far and that will trigger some sort of response from the United States. Maybe not necessarily President Trump, but other folks that are focused on the Indo-Pacific. But if I could say, the larger thing that is also looming over all of this, one of the things that we thought we had finally achieved was the idea and concept that the Indo-Pacific was going to be at the center of our strategy. That no longer appears to be the case, although the administration fudges this, but it is clear that Latin America and South America is where the dominant focus will be in the period ahead. If that is the case, that will be as challenging to Indo-Pacific interlocutors as anything else, because for us to be effective in the Indo-Pacific really requires a extraordinarily intense and determined focus by the executive branch with other parts of the U.S. government. Without that, it will be harder for us to be effective.
You did not make a single observation there, Kurt, that I could possibly quibble with. The only thing I might add is the fact that I think for our listeners, it's important to overlay all of these incredibly complex dynamics that you just laid out onto what is now an election year.
Yeah.
So I think you have made a really good case for the fact that President Trump is likely to go to Beijing, almost certainly going to go to Beijing, will come away with some type of deal that is satisfying to him, largely because what he's interested in is very short-term and tactical and has potential political consequences by way of being able to claim he got a good trade deal and curbed fentanyl, even if it mortgages American long-term strategic interests. But that the political foundations of that accommodation towards China are not strong. Indeed, there are many Republicans in Congress within the Trump administration themselves who are still very skeptical and believe in a competitive approach to China. So the key potential point of fissure is if and when folks believe they have an incentive to start distancing themselves from President Trump. And that could come concomitant with an overreach by China, let's say, as you said, against the South China Sea or against Taiwan. It could come from an overreach by the United States in making a concession to China that is too big for congressional Republicans to tolerate. But what this all seems to amount to is a potential truce that could result in real change, but is incredibly fragile and no one can count on to endure. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I do, but this idea that the president still in this second term seems almost obsessed with three leaders, with President Putin, Vladimir Putin, with Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. And these countries are so historically antithetical to our interests that it's almost hard to figure out, what the basis for this is other than just a degree of sort of authoritarian wannabeism. I do worry in 2026 when the president goes to Beijing that our PRC hosts will know how to do a variety of things on the ground there that will affect the president's psychology. I mean, we've seen when he makes visits to the Gulf states, the ability for them to, highlight every element that stroke his ego and his sense of historic status. In the end, what's interesting is, how the president, in many respects, has distorted long-standing values and characteristics that have normally been associated with republicanism. Republicanism has been about modesty. It is about planning for the long term, actually forsaking short term, benefits and the like for what's going to be at play over a long period of time. President has completely reversed that, and much more showy. Obviously, that's on clear display every day, but wanting to take very short term steps and longer term consequences be damned. The China dimension, though, I've been struck as I study Xi Jinping in these meetings, he is much more confident in the interactions with President Trump this time around than he was the first time. And my guess is that, yes, he is going to try the kind of play that you laid out to get the president to acknowledge that just as we've taken these steps in Venezuela, that the United States must understand why China will need to take various steps vis-a-vis Taiwan. To the extent that the president has any real philosophy, he does occasionally appear to either, state directly or intimate that he believes that large states should have a say over the smaller states that surround them. That is the hallmark of the most destabilizing elements of the 19th century and previous periods. If that comes to be the dominating feature of 21st century politics, we're all in a world of hurt.
It's very interesting that you put it that way, Kurt. Just before you arrived this morning, we were having a little bit of a debate about the degree to which we should think about the United States as now pursuing a spheres of influence approach. And I was saying that in the early months of the Trump administration, I was a little bit skeptical that that was the right way to think about it, because I don't ascribe that level of strategic intent or strategic coherence to President Trump and to his closest advisors. I see it as much more of a melange of instincts. But what you're actually pointing to is how we get to the explanation for why the spheres of influence approach is nonetheless still true. If one of your central instincts is that big states get to decide what happens around them and decide the fate of smaller states, that is an instinct that is nonetheless using a sphere of influence as a basic pillar of its approach. And I think as we have seen actions in Venezuela play out, The way the justification has been articulated, now focus moving to Greenland as well as to Cuba, you start to see that this idea of a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine of the Western Hemisphere being our pride of place is not just a gesticulation or an instinct. It increasingly is a coherent approach, which, like it or not, as you say, has profound implications for our ability to keep up our presence and the consistency of our policy in Asia.
Can I say, I mean, one of the things that we both try to follow and understand, I think in many respects, the president, as you rightly point out, is driven by a range of things, old biases, long-held views, and the like. And those play out then in an environment in which, he has remarkable ability to make decisions. He is probably the least contained senior executive president of the United States in our history, can do with almost what he wants without very many checks and balances, either with Republicans on the Hill or bureaucratically. This is an enabling system. But what the system has done this time is less try to shape the president into more traditional ways of historical republicanism, and instead try to take these disparate acts, the bombing of Nigeria with, out of the blue and various things, and then forge a kind of coherent strategic narrative, and then almost get the president to buy into that. What I think is fascinating is that the president often resists that. I think in many respects, the idea of a dominant ideology suggests a predictability, and the president resists that. He wants to be able to take steps doing whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And so I think that the challenge is that you're seeing almost an instinctive set of steps internationally that do not cohere to a particular sort of either historical doctrine or an approach that can be easily understood. What I think is going to be difficult, and I don't think I feel particularly confident making any predictions about this, but what I am struck by is a huge part of his appeal, both when he ran in 2016 and again the second time, was his, revulsion for an overextension of American power, the use of conflict in very challenging places that had uncertain implications for the United States, and like, why are we doing these things? And that was very powerful with the MAGA base. I would think that some of the things that we are doing now would raise some comparable concerns. We haven't seen it yet. It's too early to tell. But ultimately, I think much of what the president is thinking about internationally is out of step with what he campaigned on. And the question will be if the combination of that and maybe elements of anxiety in the workforce, accumulation of inflation, those things together might cause some real anxieties among the coalition that brought President Trump to power in 2021.
This is a great point at which to transition to another set of questions that I wanted to ask you about. And this is how we should think about the implications of all of this for business.
Yeah.
If you think about prior eras, some that we have recalled ourselves over the course of this conversation, the immediate period following World War I, any period really in which a system is collapsing and you feel increasing amounts of disorder, these have typically been times that are not very good for business. The lack of clarity, the lack of predictability, certainly in American policy, is associated with economic contraction, and certainly global conflicts, economic nationalism, all negatively correlated with economic opportunity for American and international businesses. Part of why 2025 was such an extraordinary year was because it was simultaneously characterized by massive geopolitical upheaval, largely at American hands, and a US economy that was nonetheless still remarkably resilient,
Yeah.
largely buoyed by the AI revolution. When you and I talked to macroeconomists back in April, right after Trump instituted his Liberation Day tariffs, all the predictions were that by the fourth quarter, we would be in a recession, if not worse, because of the
Yeah.
size of the economic shock that would reverberate globally. Now, of course, some of that was mediated by the fact that President Trump actually secured a slew of trade deals that prevented the worst of these tariffs from going into effect. But it's actually fairly staggering to conceive of how much upheaval there has been, despite the fact that the American economy still appears to be going strong. All of these trends that we're talking about should have implications for business. And yet, businesses seem to feel much more comfortable in some ways than you or I are about what is happening in this moment. Where are the places that they need to really be keenly focused and have a watchful eye if they want to be able to continue to navigate what is almost certain to be, as I think you and I agree, a period of protracted chaos?
Yeah. So, very well laid out, Mira. I would simply say if you look at all the factors that are buffeting global businesses that are not simply engaged in one market, the United States, let's say they have ambitions to be global players, then there are many things that they've got to keep an eye out for. They've got to focus on the path and trajectory of inflation. They've got to look at the diversification of supply chains. They've got to look at certain structural issues associated with the relationship between the United States and China. They've got to increasingly, Mira, explore whether you will see countries that are shying away from buying American products, given a degree of dissatisfaction with what we're seeing with the conduct of American foreign policy. It's not impossible to imagine that, uh, sort of Yankee go home kind of sentiments will spread in places like Europe and in Asia. These don't have to be state driven. We've seen them largely play out in countries like China, when they're able to articulate and implement sanctions against foreign products. This could be more developing from civil society and the like. And so those are all issues that businesses need to focus on. I think one of the things that has surprised both you and I, and we've talked about this, is that in many respects, even big companies address risk and global changes very irregularly and not systematically. They will occasionally have, kind of board meetings where they'll bring people in to help them think about issues, and then they'll return to sort of widget production without really understanding or thinking about how these major big buffeting trends are going to have huge implications for their business on the way forward. So what we see in the Indo-Pacific, as you've pointed out, are absolutely tectonic changes. And I think the company that says, well, just this really is none of our business, we've got to stick to our knitting, I don't think that approach is appropriate or effective any longer. Good CEOs, good C-suite, senior company officials recognize that a regular and consistent interrogation of the global risk environment is what it means to be an effective and intrepid business on the global stage. And so the first thing I would say is companies need much more focus on all of these trends and how they are playing out on their markets and on their manufacturing. The second thing I would just also say, what's changed just since the period when we talked to the macroeconomists in the winter of last year, really is what you've already addressed, which is the AI revolution. That has come on us much more quickly, much more dramatically than people understand. technology and the role of the United States on the tech scene globally has got to be something that any company focuses on intently. This is not just semiconductors and AI. It is long life batteries. It is UAVs. It is uh, you know every element of the modern economy. So I would simply say that companies have to do increasingly more homework to be effective on the global stage. I also think your general opening point is accurate in almost every set of circumstances in the 1930s, in the 1880s, when we have seen this kind of tumult and change on the global stage. Very few businesses are effective enough to be able to escape some sort of downside.
So we might have something of an AI reprieve or an AI buffeting,
Yeah.
but we're not going to escape the need to grapple with these trends.
Yeah, and I mean, many again, the most recent fourth quarter figures are so impressive and optimistic. When you look at them carefully, you see that whole sectors of economic performance in the United States are actually uh, um, underwhelming. It is really being driven by massive investments in AI. But at the same time, there is some uncertainty about whether this is a bubble or whether there will be modest structural changes along, a predictable path. Everything we've seen historically suggests that we're following the path of a bubble. But at the same time, that doesn't stop people from placing enormous bets on this continuing apace, at least for a time.
As I parse everything that you just laid out, Kurt, and there are far too many implications for business
Yeah.
from the tectonic changes that we're talking about here to possibly identify all of them. There's at least kind of two sets of trends that I feel like businesses should really be watching, in particular in Asia this year. I'm curious if you agree and how you would elaborate. The first is the incredibly uncertain relationship between the United States and China, and the need for businesses to potentially proceed cautiously, but not to, take a full 180 on anything they're doing.
Yeah.
One can imagine, and I think expect President Trump to bring a business delegation with him to Beijing, which in turn could kick off new opportunities for engagement with China and the Chinese economy that have not been ripe for some time. We could imagine those engagement opportunities to continue if they have additional visits on the sidelines of APEC in China, and so on and so forth. There's a possibility of more Chinese investment coming into the U.S. economy, which,
Yeah.
again, previously unthinkable.
Unthinkable.
But I think you and I would probably agree that one of our biggest pieces of advice to businesses would be not to over torque on that change, precisely because the rapprochement we've been discussing here is so potentially fragile and has political fissures underneath it that it is not really possible to predict where the U.S.-China relationship is going to be a year from now. Another set of trends that I hope we can continue to watch together in the coming months is the question of how changed behavior amongst allies and partners both creates and closes opportunities for business. If you think, for example, of the fact of the United States loosening its technology export controls on critical chips, obviously part of the push during the Biden administration to restrict chip sales to China also involved encouraging third countries like Japan and the Netherlands to do the same. If the United States is removing its own restrictions, we might expect third countries to resume participation in Chinese markets in ways that they haven't, although we haven't quite seen that yet. But it's certainly something to watch out for. Likewise, as you've put forth, if our allies are no longer sure that they can be with us or that we're with them, we will presumably start to see some hedging or diversification behavior in their defense and other industries, even if they don't back away from the alliance or the treaty commitment, which I don't expect that any will. Under these circumstances, I think it's pretty natural that both European partners and countries like Japan would start to think more both about indigenous defense production as well as alternate supply chains.
Yeah.
Are there other aspects of changed alliance alignment that you think businesses need to be watching closely? Because in some ways, that storyline is the quiet storyline because it involves thus far relatively little upheaval, but probably under the surface some profound change.
Yeah. So look, many points, really good points you've laid out, Mira, but let me just unpack just a couple if I can. It is often the case when we think about U.S. business in China, we think that we're the only country that are making decisions here. But if you look carefully at really Xi Jinping's philosophy, his overall approach, it is to increasingly limit opportunities for American and other businesses in China. He is seeking in almost every case to champion Chinese manufacturing, luxury goods, products across the board. And so, we often don't fully understand this, but almost all of President Xi's, kind of philosophy and approaches to the Chinese economy is towards self-sufficiency and frankly to create reliances running the other direction in which countries are more reliant on China. And so ultimately there may be some short-term deals, Mira, but those will be tactical from the Chinese perspective. They ultimately want to move away from those things. They'll find few areas to be able to signal working with the United States, but ultimately their interests are in a highly resilient, self-sufficient economy that is largely protected from the vicissitudes of an unpredictable United States. One of the surprises of 2025, from my perspective, is how much allies and partners were willing to do things economically, with funds, with investments, to keep the United States on side. And it suggests how important most of these countries deep down view the United States. As you point out, all of them are trying to diversify and hedge. They're trying to build relations among themselves. They're trying to spend more money on defense issues. They're trying to work where they can with new partners like in Europe, and they want to have their best possible arrangements for now with Beijing. Every partner in Asia is doing that, from Japan to Australia to South Korea. And we see that very clearly. But what is number one on their list is to continue the relationship with the United States. And here's the interesting thing from my perspective, Mira. These countries, they find the brutal tariffs challenging and uncomfortable and clearly not in their strategic interests, but they will take it as long as they feel that the United States is more aligned towards them than towards China. If suddenly we depart into a true G2 in which these countries no longer have confidence in the security guarantee and the political support from the United States, that's when countries will really start to think about defecting. And then there will be real consequences for American business. Right now, American businesses actually have some advantages because these countries want to send a signal that to President Trump and his team that, hey, it's come on in, the water's fine, and we'll work with you. But if it is believed that we are no longer strategically reliable, the trickle-down effects will not just be on the military and security side, but on the business side as well.
Slowly and then all at once,
Yeah,
potentially.
yeah.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Kurt.
Oh, it's great.
No one I'd rather have it with, and far too much to chew on as we think about the year ahead.
And I think it's terrific, Mira, that you're going to do this, helping folks think strategically about the period ahead should be job one for all of us. These should not simply be the domains of strategists. Increasingly, senior executives and others must train themselves to be thinking about these issues, because not only does it matter for peace and stability, it matters for products and services.
Couldn't agree more. Needless to say, what we do here at the Asia Group every day. And as the next few months unfold, I hope you'll join us again, perhaps to look ahead to President Trump's trip to Beijing.
We'll look forward to it very much. Thank you, Mira.
Thanks, Kurt. As I reflect on my conversation with Dr. Kurt Campbell, I am struck by the extent of uncertainty and the number of unknowns that we face in this truly sui generis period of time. While Kurt and I spoke a lot about some historical analogies that we might find relevant, we talked about geopolitics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for example, or the period immediately after World War I. The reality is we don't have a perfect historical parallel for a moment like this one. We've never seen a situation in which the reigning global hegemon chose willfully to dismantle an ordering system that was still returning significant benefits both for itself and for the world. We're used to those systems coming down because of external shocks like wars or internal collapse of the regime in question. This is a different case entirely. So what does that mean for us when we're thinking about the forces that are reshaping our world and what it means for business? It means that we should never be too overconfident that any trend, any force that we're seeing prevail in this moment will last, and that we should stop early and often to reassess the picture that we're seeing. After all, when rapid change is so dense and complex, it can be incredibly difficult to understand unless we analyze it in its component parts and stop to assess the true nature of the picture that we're seeing. I'm grateful for this conversation with Kurt, kicking us off and helping us to really situate ourselves in this unprecedented moment that we're in, and looking forward to exploring much more over the course of what comes next. This episode was produced by Refund, Dewey Asked to Know, and executive produced by Lauren Dewick with editorial input from Prashant Jha. It also contained music by Cody Martin via Soundstripe. What Comes Next is a production of the Asia Group and is powered by TAG AI, TAG's geopolitical decision engine for business. We'll see you on the next episode.